All right, everyone, welcome back. Ben and I ride again, this time looking to discuss music and its relation to the soul. We both went to the same liberal arts college, which was formed in reaction to the 60s and 70s explosion, and always had a decidedly anti-rock music bias, which I'm told even 40 years later is still in full force, which I find interesting, especially considering that the musical landscape has shifted dramatically since then. And Ben has recently discovered what seems to be a profound love for Pink Floyd, who I remember listening to a lot in high school, but I haven't really revisited since then. And your experience with Pink Floyd's music made you, and your interactions with those associated with the school who claim that it's bad for the soul, made you start to wonder exactly what it means for music to be good or bad for the soul. And you had some thoughts on that. So I'd like to open with you, just given what you're thinking on that, and we'll just riff on it and see where we go.
Yeah. Well, because I think it's always interesting to see people's reactions when I tell them, like, a couple of days ago, I turned all the lights off in my room and I sat alone listening to the entirety of The Wall by myself, all hour and 20 minutes of it. And it was
It's an hour and 20 minutes long, the album.
It was a double record and both sides. So I think it comes around to something like an hour and 20 minutes.
That's an enormous amount of composition.
Yeah, there's so much going on. And I remember as I was listening, because I think, well, actually it's kind of the real origin story for the Pink Floyd thing, which goes back to one of the Dune trailers, to kind of touch on the previous episode. Right. They have Hans Zimmer did a cover of Eclipse from Dark Side of the Moon, which appears in one of the trailers. And I was like, oh yeah, it's Pink Floyd. And then I listened to more of them, like, this is awesome. And I remember as I was listening to them, I was struck that, and this is more in retrospect, but I had the same, it arrested my attention in the same way that listening to something by Bach or Mozart arrests your attention, where it's interesting and it's pleasant to hear, it's pleasant to the ear, and it kind of, you want to listen to more, and it kind of draws you away from something you might be doing. It's not good as background music. And in that respect, it kind of, I was struck by the fact that, like, this is music that it's evidently of a higher caliber and degree of complexity, because it draws you in a way that, kind of, whether it's kind of pop dance music or chamber music, to kind of stay true to the parallelism there between classical and modern music. I was struck by that. This is serious stuff. This is serious music. Mm-hmm. I mean, the musicians themselves, I mean, it is incredible musicianship, production, and so on. And as I was listening to, I think it was Wish You Were Here, the massive, the multi-part Shine On You Crazy Diamond, where right. you have themes going and then returning and being varied and perfectly in just as complicated and interesting a way as you have in classical sonatas and so on. And I remember thinking, this can't be what the anti-rock music people are thinking of, mm-hmm. when they're thinking rock music is bad for the soul and bad for the intellect. And I brought it up, actually. I brought it up with some people because I work up there, and I brought it up with some people, and they're like, it just seems so wrong. I'm like, but why? Why does it seem wrong? And they really couldn't give me an answer other than repeating the criticisms of, well, the rhythms, they awaken base passions and stuff like that, where it's like, well, yeah, but the words and the rest of the music also have an influence. So I was frustrated by the fact that it seemed like they were more just kind of voicing a cultural critique, that, there was a wild subculture associated with rock music that gave voice and vent to base passions. But I'm not sure it was the rock music alone that did that. So I've been kind of frustrated because what it comes down to in my mind is like the sort of the problem or the question is, I I think I must be somewhere between, on the one side, the people who say, music is just, or movies or whatever, it's just entertainment, it's just fun, it doesn't really matter what you listen to or what you watch. I just, in my own experience of listening to things and sort of how I find myself reacting,
Mhm.
I can't believe that there's no effect. And that some music, some movies, some books are just, depending on what mood I'm in, are just, it's worse, and it's not going to help, to read or listen to those things. So I don't subscribe to that. On one extreme, there's a kind of indifference, but on the other extreme, there's, it matters so much that you should only listen to like pieces by Mozart and Bach, because you'll be led into emotional disorder if you listen to anything else. And I think that's just as misguided, but being able, trying to navigate, okay, well, there's a massive amount of space between those two extremes. And I think there's room between those two extremes for someone who likes to listen to Mozart and Beethoven and Bach and Rachmaninoff and Pink Floyd, and thinks that it's not entirely wrong to include people like Pink Floyd. And there are other contemporary or modern bands, or musicians who I would list there. It's just been riffing on Pink Floyd a lot, but it's, I think there's room in between those two extremes for someone who thinks those names belong together, and that there must be some kind of unifying critical basis for including them together. But it's hard to know exactly how to formulate that. And it's an interesting subject, because there's so much music out there, and I don't think people, personally, I don't think people give enough thought to, critically judging and choosing what it is they listen to. Or if they do, they go to the far extreme over here, where it's they only listen to a few things. I think there's got to be a more moderate middle way. I just don't know what it is as of now.
Yeah, there's a lot. Let's see. All right, so we just made a dramatic jump in space time for me to get some headphones on. Sorry about that echo. So there was a lot that I heard there. I think the biggest thing that comes to mind, that jumps out to me based on what you're saying, as far as the resistance to something, to any sort of rock music, regardless of how complex melodically, harmonically, and arrangement wise it might be, seems to be the focus on the beat and its supposedly emotionally disordered nature, and this fear that if you listen to anything rock based, that it is going to disorder your emotions, which seems like an interesting place to start here. And I do remember being struck by this when at a friend's house, a few years ago. Her dad is a huge Beatles fan, and he was watching a retrospective, and they showed their original performance on the Ed Sullivan Show when they first came to America, and really is kind of what broke them as the big band. And it's kind of hilarious watching it now, having basically read about that from conservative viewpoints at the times as being, this emergence of the devil into, the city on a hill that would slowly poison society. And it sounds highly dramatic when you read an account of it written from that perspective, but actually seeing it happen, it seems so innocent and almost goofy that it's hard to pick up anything like that. The band is good and high energy, but still like fairly sloppy and not at all like an overwhelming spectacle. And they all have their goofy haircuts and everything like that. And you have the crowd, it's amazing to watch the reactions of the mostly female crowd, probably high school kids for the most part. And everyone is dressed still in that 1950s bland fashion, for lack of a better word, very businesslike, very streamlined, no dramatic statements. And every time they kick into a song, into anything, there's just this overwhelming just outpouring of just ecstatic energy from the crowd, like the original boy band fans of screaming and crying and trying to to hold out their hands and reach the band members. And so there is this really interesting, like, energetic tidal wave that they seem to be unlocking with that music, even though the performance seems pretty dinky and amateur by today's standards. They were clearly onto something, and that's what launched them to become the most famous band of all time. So there's something like, and the immediate reactions is to be like, oh, it's disordered, that we shouldn't be having this kind of upspring of emotion, like that's a dangerous force. And maybe in some ways it is, but I think the argument to that would be something like, maybe what it's actually doing is incorporating something that was unfairly excluded from the human person, and that any kind of dramatic societal upheavals that could be blamed on it were really a necessary balancing out of something that wasn't being given its due before. And I think you can maybe see that it has been incorporated more now by the fact that rock music has pretty much just become default mainstream music, and nothing really cutting edge, as far as I'm aware of, is happening in the rock music world. It's much more of an electronic based scene now. That's where anything cutting edge is coming from. Where there may be acoustic instruments, but everything is very filtered through the medium of computers, and everything is played to a grid at this point. So it's really not a raw rock music type of world anymore. So that kind of makes me wonder if that's something that just became incorporated, and now it's not edgy because that energy has been released, reeled back in, and integrated. And I wonder if there's maybe just bad memories of that time that are associated with that energetic release. How does that land with you?
That seems reasonable. I mean, it's really hard. There's always going to be kind of an intergenerational tension on this kind of subject. Music seems to be sort of a touchstone for generational identity in a way that a lot of other things aren't. To the point where when you hear, it's always, or almost always, the people who are like the originators of this critique are always come across as fuddy, usually older, mostly academic white dudes who are like, music is going to destroy society, and it's hard to separate the actual musical critique from the sort of intergenerational conflict. So it's difficult for me to have and it's hard for me not to have opinions about things, and in particular about that kind of thing. So it's hard for me to say what I think objectively about it. I think there's something to both sides, like you were saying. Like on the one hand, it's not as though there is something being awakened by the music, and there is also, maybe this is revisionist history, but it's known that the 40s and 50s were not necessarily the best time for society, looking at and trying to remedy certain repressive tendencies, so that it seems like I would probably land more on the side of, in the long run, it's probably healthier that there be this sort of, I know a lot of people talk about music as an outlet, as an emotional outlet for things that, you have this buildup of a variety of emotional pressures and the like. And just to hear, hearing a song that you really love, that really upbeat, it can really do a lot of good and relieve relieve stress or whatever it is. And in that respect, it seems like merely because there's an emotional release associated with the music doesn't necessarily make it bad. And I think that, and I'm sure that the original critics probably didn't think that necessarily, because, if you listen to Mozart or Beethoven or Bach, there's emotion associated with it. I think that there's something raw and kind of intense about the kind of emotion that's being released, which I think is what gives the critics pause.
Right. And it's a little bit of a destructive type of emotion in many ways. Not necessarily, well, you can kind of see the difference if you trace like the original Ed Sullivan performance of the Beatles all the way to what most people kind of characterize as sort of the end of rock music, which was Woodstock 99, which basically resulted in a full-scale riot and assaults of concert goers and basically an entire just meltdown at this rock concert, which is pretty much the polar opposite of the intended values of the original Woodstock festival. So a lot of people said, okay, this is burned out at this point. Like we've gotten to rock bottom of the emotions that rock music was exploring, and it's time to move on from this because it's, this is dangerous. So there's something to be said for that. But that's where I was kind of getting at the idea of integrating it. And we can shift more into talking about kind of specific the qualities that make something like Pink Floyd specifically musically valuable. But I think it's an important thing for me as I've thought about this issue over the years is that I think a lot of it has to do with a discomfort with the type of emotion that is released by the rock and roll rhythm. And I think that a lot of the resistance to it is tied up with a fear or a discomfort with those kind of emotions. And like with anything, there is some good reason for that, but also perhaps it's a resistance to the necessary corrective of integrating that part of ourselves.
Yeah.
And perhaps the fact that rock rhythms generally don't cause people to go into a frenzy as soon as they hear them now is an indication that we've kind of grown up with that part of ourselves to some extent. So that's kind of what I have taken as the root cause of that division as I've thought about it. And it's telling that the Beatles are still kind of the, public enemy number one at school. And I think it's really because it's that performance, that moment where they kind of like unleash that pent up energy that has probably been, decades in the making, maybe since like the Roaring 20s. You had that horrible stretch of Great Depression, war, and then 50s conformity kind of keeping all that under the surface. And they just kind of unlocked it. So I think there's that, but then I think there's also a sort of snobbery as far as technical ability and compositional complexity when it comes to rock music as compared to classical music, very broadly defined. There's some who essentially consider Mozart to be the only one of true value, and that's perfection. There's others that take a broader perspective. And much of the accusation is that rock-based music is super simple and repetitive, and there's nothing interesting and nothing that's going to stimulate the intellect there. But bands like Pink Floyd, and I would think even others that were famous rock bands like Queen is very musically complex. Rush is very musically complex. I think that some of the jam bands, like Allman Brothers or Grateful Dead, I remember listening to a lot of that when I was in high school and learning how to play guitar. And so a lot of it just evolves into meandering garbage, but there's also some really cool pieces that are like a half-hour jam that navigate all kinds of instrumental back and forth, stopping at little islands of familiarity where they'll play the chorus again and then go off for another 15 minutes and find it in a different place, which I remember being blown away with when I was first learning music. Just this kind of taking a popular song format and extending it into this massive improvisation that can be something different every night. I think you'd have to consider that as well. But maybe it'd be good just to kind of touch on what you find to be things that are interesting compositionally that you've latched onto.
Well, before I do that, I kind of want to see if I can restate what it is you said and then address. So I think there are essentially two questions that you're boiling it down to. One is a sort of social question about emotion and integration and so on. And it seems like that's, even though it's outwardly a very specific historical question about the role of rock music, it seems like it's a broader social question that goes back to Plato, that there's always a social component to music. And for whatever reason, to music in particular. And it seems like music does have a role. All of the classical philosophers agree that musical formation is an essential part of education. And so it seems like music does have the power to accomplish on a kind of emotional integration, which a lot of other art appreciation doesn't.
Mhm.
And because of that, it seems like it's important to have the right approach to musical criticism in order to know what in fact is advisable, and what belongs to musical formation. Because I think a lot of the classical philosophers would have had a somewhat restricted vision of what should belong in a musical formation. But it seems like that's the first question, or the first issue, is that music has a social and psychological and intellectual dimension to it, and it belongs in an education. It belongs in as a part of formation. So knowing what music to listen to, or have children and young adults listen to, and what music to continue to listen to when you're an adult, and how much of it, like those are important questions, and at least they have to be answered in part by an assessment of music itself. And that kind of leads into the second question that you're asking, which is, what makes good music? What makes the kind of music that you could advise as part of musical formation that's actually going to be good for the development of the soul?
Right. Because I think that the focus on rhythmic patterns is interesting, because even in what we would refer to as highly complex music, rhythm is rarely all that complex. I mean, even in symphonic music, usually the rhythm can be counted out in some simple 1, 2, 3, 4 approach, time signature, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2,
duple
3.
or triple time.
Yeah, or a waltz. And so the rhythm is not really any more complex. It's just there's a different emotional resonance with that. So it seems like that realm, the emotional discussion we're having, seems to be in the realm of rhythm. But then complexity has to be something different, because I don't see the rhythmic complexity really necessarily differing across types of music that would be considered dangerous and edifying. So
I see that.
Yeah. So what would you take to be musical complexity that makes something worth listening to?
Well, I think I mean it's an easy question. There you go. It's a softball. Let me think about it.
Right. Well, I think maybe what I'm trying to get at is to bracket rhythm in that emotional and cultural disagreement section, which we could come back to as well. But then the other elements of music, melody, harmony, delivery, like the specific vocal timbre of the singer, the actual individual performance on the instrument. What grabs you in that realm outside of the realm of rhythm?
Well, I think I'll just try to see. I'll see what I can say. Let's see. I think that one of the first things that really interests me is when you hear the idea of a theme or a motif that you hear, and then you're like, okay, I recognize it. You hear it, like maybe they repeat it once, and you're like, okay, that's a piece of musical information that I have in my mind, and then you start to listen for it. And then when you hear it again, you're like, okay, there it is again. So there's that sense of recognition. That's gonna, that repetitive quality of musical themes and motifs, like that's in all music. Or if it's not in all music, it's intentionally rejected by the composer, like in atonal or that kind of thing. And I'm sure that there are some musical purists who would disagree with how I'm characterizing atonal music. So, that's what I have heard is what it sounds like. But so if you're just beginning with, that core musical element of like it's not even a full melody necessarily. It's a motif or something. You hear that. I think that what makes music interesting is when you have a composer or an artist who can continually satisfy that sense of recognition, but without only ever just repeating the theme, whether it's changing it harmonically, you have it in a different key, whether it's you suddenly the original theme you start to recognize as counterpoint underneath another theme. You're like, oh, wait a minute, it's that original thing. Like in the Wall, for instance, the riff in Another Brick in the Wall, part 2, well, it's part 1, but then also part 2, that da 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 da.
Oh yeah.
If you the further along in the Wall you go, it shows up everywhere, whether as a bass line, it becomes like the chord progression at the climax of the trial, near the end of the record. But you hear it here and there, and what it does is it really gives that sense of, okay, we're still in the same larger piece of music, even though we're about 45 minutes later than the original theme. The same goes for their little motif in "Wish You Were Here," "Shine On You Crazy Diamond," the boom 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 boom, where that shows up, and as soon as you hear it again, you're like, after the 3 interlude pieces, you're like, oh wait, we're back in that, and suddenly you have there's that satisfying sense of, oh, the recognition, okay, we're here again. And it really helps to, when someone can do that kind of thing well, where they can repeat but kind of create the sense of having gone somewhere, and without simply just have it be something completely different. You've gone somewhere and you haven't simply returned to where you started from. You've actually made some kind of a journey along the way, whether both emotionally and harmonically and melodically. That's like that I think that's the number one thing that I look for, that immediately stands out to me when, to take a classical example. I mean, I guess Bach is sort of his own thing, but the musical offering by Bach, which actually comes up in the book Gödel, Escher, Bach. Bach takes it. It's essentially just a massive variation on a single theme that was given to him by Frederick the Great. And there's the whole idea of canon and fugue, where you take a theme or a motif, and then you find out all sorts of ways to vary it, but you vary it only to the degree you don't want to go past the degree of recognition. And it is listening for you. The artfulness and that kind of thing is listening for how the artist is, how masterfully they can stretch a theme or a motif and still have it be recognizable, but see how many different things they can do with it. And still, it just sends the impression they're in control of it the whole time. And it gives the sense of craft. It lends a sense of unity, especially that notion of recapitulation, or that you return to the theme, like in classical sonata form. You have the initial statement of the theme, then you switch keys and you're in the second theme. But that sense of, okay, the movement's almost done when you return back to the original key and the original theme. It's a very basic way of looking at it, but I think that's a central compositional element that I would look for, and that if I see it done to a certain degree of finesse, I would say, okay, this is more than just fun music. This is serious music. I think that's at least a first level of complexity that I would look for, that would prompt me to characterize music as actually pretty good.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I don't know what I was expecting you to say, but that wasn't it. So that's a very interesting. It kind of reminds me of what you're saying. Reminds me of like storytelling, like character development, and that good writers, good novelists can draw a character, draw an enormous amount of change out of the same character, and continue to have their core qualities surface, but in different ways as they come to different decision points, while the character is dramatically changing and yet preserving that core sense of who they are. Like Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, like she's still very much like the same character as at the beginning, but at the same time, she's radically different than the way that she starts the story. But you can still see those same attitudes, like I'll think about it tomorrow when I can stand it. I'll think about it later when I can stand it. All those little motifs that she continually uses as to kind of make her decisions are still there at the end, even though there's been this huge transformation over the course of like 800 pages. Yeah. And there's something about that we tend to latch on to, perhaps just recognizing our own life story in something like that, our own experience. Maybe there's something similar at work with what you're talking about with recapitulation, but in inventive ways that remind you that you're still within the same story. Because the wall in particular, I don't know if it qualifies as like a concept album, but it seems like a very story based
It's a rock
album.
opera.
A rock opera. There you go. Yeah, it has a very theatrical quality to it, and it feels very. I'll have to re-listen to it. I do remember listening to it all the way through several times in high school, and it has a very theatrical and like has a sense of storyline. So
Yeah.
maybe there's some connection between those two things. What do you
Mhm.
think of that?
I think there is. I think I hadn't thought about it in connection with stories and characters, but I think that's really true. That someone who's a master of their themes, they're like characters. I'm trying to think of when in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the melody that will eventually become the Ode to Joy in the last movement appears in several different forms in the preceding movements. And it appears as kind of oftentimes as an interlude or a break from much more brooding or serious sounding stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because it gives you an intimation of what's to come. And if you know the piece, then you're like, it gives you that there's the thrill of anticipation. It's not coming yet, but like what's going to come down the road. And it's almost like when you it's like when if you read something and you reread it, you have that same experience. So it's interesting to kind of associate characters and motifs and themes like that. I hadn't thought about that, but I think that's true. I think that's there's a similar craft going on, and I think the key really is in both cases the craftsmanship is knowing how to maintain.
Okay, sorry, we had a little cut there. Ben, continue commenting on character development in music. We had been talking about Beethoven's Ninth and the way that that melody morphs
Yeah.
as it goes.
Um, I think I was just mostly I was just kind of commenting that I liked the association you made with storytelling. And actually, right as you hit the record button again, it struck me that this is an interesting way, looking at it from the lens of story, is an interesting way of segueing into the subject of musical form.
Mhm.
Because from the standpoint of, and this is to once again touch on the subject of archetypes like we did last time, but
It always
uh,
gets there.
Jordan Peterson would be so proud. Um, the it's interesting how like with stories, in a way, how every story is going to end within a couple pages or within a chapter or two. Like, oh, I know the kind of story this is, and generally how it's going to end because the archetypes that are being chiseled out, and you're like, oh, okay, this is what it is. That doesn't stop you reading it because the fun is seeing it play out. But it seems like in the case of character development, when you mentioned character development, I haven't read Gone with the Wind, but the person I thought of instantly was Pierre from War and Peace, who
Okay.
of all the characters in there, he has a very similar sort of trajectory as Scarlett O'Hara in the sense that there's a lot that happens to him in the many years of his life that are depicted in that book, and he's going through a kind of internal hero's journey, so that in a way, when you reach the end, you're like, I knew, at least instinctively, he was going to end like this, but I didn't know exactly what it was going to look like. So there's the pleasure in that instance is the mixture of recognition of of recognizing how it was going to end right from the beginning, but also being surprised by how it actually, how what you're recognizing manifests itself. And to kind of look at it from the subject of music, thematic development and that sort of thing that I was talking about earlier, like that's the first thing that I would look for. But I think that musical form is a way of kind of building on that idea and kind of making it more complicated and solidifying it. I mentioned sonata form. If you happen to know the structure that a composer is trying to play out, that helps you that shapes your understanding of, okay, this theme is the one that's going to come back, so I should listen for this theme, because it's structured in the sense of, okay, the first theme is going to be the primary theme, and that's going to be the one to which you will return in the recapitulation portion at the end, after having meandered through a couple of other themes and keys, so that if you know what you're listening to. And I think that's one of the reasons that people who are not used to classical music, when they first hear it, it's kind of it's impenetrable, because it seems like it's just a lot of pretty noise. Whereas, you look at like a modern song structure, like, there's still musical form there. You have intro, verse 1, chorus, verse 2, chorus, bridge, chorus, chorus. And like that sense of anticipation when you hit the bridge. Usually it's like you drop down to the sixth, and you're like, "Ooh, it's kind of minor now." And you got to wander around, and then you get back to the dominant. And you're like, "Oh boy, here we go!" And then you drop to the tonic, and all of a sudden you're just belting out the final chorus.
Right.
But that's still banking on that sense of anticipation, recognition, and so on. So there's still a musical form there. It just happens to be different, and in many ways, I think. And here's maybe a critique. It's somewhat simpler, and it's harder to vary inventively than I think classical forms are. Because with sonata form, once you know the form, you're like, okay, well, there's actually a lot of freedom in between. You at some point you have to state the first theme, you have to state the second theme, and there are certain requirements about what key each of those have to be in. But you can do a lot in between. You can develop the theme. Beethoven is well known for being someone who really develops his themes and kind of which helps to make the return, the recapitulation, that much more satisfying. But it's not just that sense of you recognize a theme and it comes back and you're happy. There's a sense of there's an additional structure or layer of complexity, which is there are different forms or ways of structuring what to look for and what to expect in the recapitulation, and how to organize the sequence of emotional responses of anticipation and release. So I think that's another layer of complexity that I would look for. And I think that the forms, in a certain way, the forms of music are to musical appreciation, I think, in a certain way, what the archetypes would be in literary appreciation, where once you know and you're familiar enough with the prevailing archetypes within a tradition, it helps you to actually appreciate what you're reading better, because at least at some level, what the author is trying to do, and it helps you to appreciate it at a higher level of detail. I think the same thing goes for musical form. That was a lot of stuff, but I just, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it makes me think that I'm still thinking about that overlap between storytelling and music as pointing to something deeper as to why both of those are so important to us, for one, but also why some stories and some forms of music seem to strike us much deeper and are ones that we hold in higher regard, even though it seems like they're both art forms that are messing with the same machinery, which I guess you could say something is like our attempts to understand change. Like I've heard that said of storytelling, that really what storytelling is a mechanism by which we understand change, and that as we internalize simple stories, we start to understand the patterns of change and then how we fit into those, and so therefore how to navigate it, because otherwise things would just be an overwhelming chaos, because everything is constantly changing. But if you have no way to grasp it and no way to fit yourself into it, it's just chaos and it's a nightmare. So that's why I think, like, you can see that with like reading stories to little kids, like most of the stories are to help them internalize patterns that are happening in the changing world. And I think that's why they like reading stories again and again, or watching a movie again and again, is they're trying to latch onto that, and then they go out and try to use it to structure the world. So it seems like music is kind of operating by using that same machinery, like how we understand change. But it's a deeper level because there's no words, and it's much more it's tapping into something much more universal. But
Yeah.
it seems to be that same machinery that it's playing with. And the focus on recapitulation, you're right, it's not merely just hearing the same thing again that is satisfying. It's maybe being able to latch onto that same thing despite the way the context has changed around it. Because a certain motif might sound one way depending on what the harmonic background is behind it, but have a very different emotional character with a different harmonic backing, even though it's the same notes and the same intervals.
Yeah.
And the fact that we can still latch onto it, even though something's changed behind it, is perhaps maybe just giving us that reassurance, like, okay, I'm grasping what's happening here, how things are changing. But that the more you can vary that, and the more change you can introduce and yet still make it graspable for an audience, the more we perhaps perceive it as great music.
Interesting. That's interesting. The I guess what I was getting at with the idea of musical form was almost trying to show that, like, once you know the forms, that's sort of like a child hearing the story, you know, the classic good versus evil, like that, then they want to hear that, and you know what to look for. So that part of the delight is recognizing the pattern that's at work in music. Not just there's the emotional satisfaction of seeing the pattern played out, but there's also the kind of intellectual satisfaction of recognizing, oh, that's what he's doing. It's sort of like when you're reading a really interesting sci-fi story, or like reading a kind of complicated poem or essay or something. When you have that light bulb moment when you're reading a great philosopher, you're like, oh, I know what's happening here. And then you kind of flip back to the pages before, you're like, okay, this is definitely what's going on. And then so what you're looking for, there's both, if it's a well-told story, you're enjoying the telling of it, but there's the intellectual excitement of, like, am I right? Was I correct in my assessment of what's actually going on here? So you're simultaneously reveling in the pattern as it unfolds, but you're also appreciating the pattern you're trying to appreciate it at an almost transtemporal level, where you think you see the whole thing, and the pleasure is seeing whether or not the unfolding actually winds up filling in the pattern you think is at work. That's a really weird way of putting it.
Oh, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that can explain the universality of it. If that's really what the pleasure is, then there's all kinds of ways that you could express that, but that the higher regard we hold music in is maybe going to be proportionate to how much it makes us do that work, but it's also not impossible to do. Sort of like, we've touched on before, like with when you get into a sort of state of flow with it, like it's not so complex that you just can't grasp anything, because that's not really pleasurable. If music is like, if you're listening to really esoteric jazz and you've never played jazz and you have no understanding of the harmonics at work, it's really just chaotic, and it's not pleasurable because you simply can't grasp anything that's going on. But then at the same time, you have the equivalent of boredom. If something's incredibly repetitive and you know exactly how it's going to go, and once you've heard the chorus introduced, you just know you'll hear it a few more times and the verses will sound the same, and it's boredom. So there's really that sweet spot where it's challenging and yet you're still able to do it. And it's playing with that same machinery of, like, spotting the pattern, making a guess as to what the pattern will be, and seeing it filled in and knowing whether you're right or not. And even if you're wrong, there's also that pleasure in being surprised, be like, oh, I would never have expected that to hear the motif in this context again, and then shift away, things like that.
That's interesting, because that also strikes me as, if there really are those two layers of, there's kind of the more emotional, more immediate satisfaction of enjoying the process, but also that level of enjoying seeing if it is in fact what you're thinking it's going to be. There's multiple levels there. That suggests to me at least one way of formulating the rationale for why you don't want to be too strict about what music you listen to, because it seems like if you say, no, there are only a couple of acceptable patterns that for music to have, then you're only focusing on cultivating that lower sense of, I know what's coming and I can enjoy it. And that's all I'm supposed to be doing with music. And the same thing goes, honestly, like these are parallel critiques for both literature and music, where if there really are two layers of emotion, and or two layers of response to music and appreciation of music, then it seems like you need to be open to the possibility of there being new patterns, new ways of phrasing musical themes, new ways of organizing the musical pleasure of anticipation and reward. The same goes in literature. You have to be open to the possibility of new patterns and new story structures, new ways of revealing those more basic expectations. So it seems like, because if you're constantly only living within the same pattern, the same few patterns, it's ironic actually that the people who are most advocating rigidity at the level of musical form for the sake of maintaining the dominance of the intellect, in a certain way, that's actually stymieing the development of the intellect, because if the intellectual dimension of music is the picking out and trying to anticipate what pattern is at work, then you're kind of letting your intellect atrophy if you never train it to recognize new patterns. So that you almost, for the sake of maintaining, of educating the intellect along with the emotions with music, for precisely that, if you want to do that, for precisely that reason, you actually need to be less restrictive in, or at least more open about the different musical forms that you accept. Because I mean, I should be clear. I think the basic, the modern pop song structure is pretty boring, because it's hard to vary it within the 5 minute, the max 5 minute time limit that's pretty much imposed on all pop music. And I use pop music very broadly. There's only so much, because of the time limit. Like if you had a longer amount of time, you can do more interesting things with it, and you can have that kind of inventiveness that people at more complicated levels of music are putting into it. But it's hard to do that when you have that time limit there. So it seems like form and the ability to, because then the artist is someone who has this pattern in their head. They're like, how can I shape something according to this pattern in such a way that it'll both please people but also challenge them. And I think that the ability, both the pattern that they try to impose and the craft and success by which they actually wind up imposing it on sound, I think those are both criteria for determining really how objectively good the music is.
Wait, say that last part again. Their level of craft with
the level of both the pattern they're using and how well executed the imposition of pattern on tone and sound and so on. I think that's how you have to approach trying to make an objective evaluation of whether or not this music is good and how good it is.
Right. Yeah. Because you also have to bring in, I think it's a good time to consider like the actual execution and performance of the music and instrumentation choices, arrangement choices, etc. Because the Ode to Joy, I mean, that's one of the most famous melodies of all time, and for good reason. But it's one thing if I just, if that hadn't been invented and I just walked up to a little Casio keyboard and just if I just did that and said, look, I've just invented the best melody of all time, you'd say, well, I mean, it's really not that much, But then when you hear that with the emotional payoff of having gone through everything that comes before, when you hear that belted out by a full choir backed by an orchestra, it has immensely more power. So it's not purely that form of the intervals and duration that's giving it the power, although that's part of it. It's also, like you're saying, the craft of knowing how to make that concrete in a way and in a context in which it has that emotional payoff too. And I think the pop music that's overly simplistic always does that in kind of the same way, in a very limited set of instruments and vocal delivery techniques. And vocals are becoming more and more similar, I feel like, by the day. And so you kind of get the payoff, but it's sort of the same one every time. There isn't really an inventiveness as to how can I bring more life from the same 7 notes.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's really true. And I mean, it kind of brings to mind too, like jam bands, like you were saying. I mean, even a lot of pop music, I feel like when they go on tour, it's really just them singing. But like, I don't even know how often there are musicians back there actually playing the music again. I feel like there's a lot of backing track, a lot of dependence on pre-recorded stuff.
I think so. I think
Whereas something like a jam.
I think there's a huge, I think with pop music now, there's a huge concern with it has to be perfectly executed just like the radio at a live show. And there's an immense focus on that, and like spontaneity of any kind is really discouraged. So like I think a lot of times these days, like in the earpieces that they have, I think oftentimes they're actually playing along to the studio track, even to make sure that the rhythm is exactly the same as it is on the studio track, among many other things. Or maybe they're just singing to a backing track. And even if there's maybe the appearance of live musicians, they're all still rigidly playing along to the perfect studio track in order to replicate that performance. And in one sense, it works. You get what you paid for. You get those songs, but you're not getting any kind of that twist that you hear the pattern and then you recognize like, oh, it's still the same thing, but it's a little different now.
Yeah. You know, like, whereas I'd compare that with something like we saw Dawes over the Thanksgiving weekend, and it was amazing. But I was struck by the fact that, I recognized the songs. They played songs that everybody knew and could sing along with, but it was cool because it was not, they decided, like I think a lot of rock bands would, which is, to embrace the fact that it's never going to be the same. Even though you're playing the same song, it's never going to be exactly the same. So why not own that, embrace it, and kind of, enjoy the fun of improvising and seeing how well in the moment you can focus on trying to, play with something while retaining its identity.
Right.
You have like 7 to 10 minute versions of songs, which on the album are like 3 to 4 minutes, because they've got, the guitar solo, or they've got, now they're gonna play around. The two guitarists are gonna kind of improvise with each other and play off each other. I think that's a level of craft which is, that I think sets, because they're trying to actually embrace that craftsmanship of basically, unity and identity, in unity in diversity, you might say, is one shorthand way of putting it. Trying to maintain that artistically, they're embracing that and they're executing it well. I think that's one way of saying, people who can do this and do it in a way that's actually satisfying musically are better artists or better musicians, and the music that they're doing is better than music where they don't even try that kind of thing, where they don't even try to kind of embrace the craftsmanship of maintaining unity in diversity at a musical level.
And you could say
that's one level,
right? And you could say that's maybe better because it's better for us, because what we have to do to survive and thrive is pattern recognition at its basis. Like that is how we process the world, is figuring out the patterns and anticipating what patterns are going to happen next and recognizing them when you see them again in different contexts, everything we've been talking about. So something that challenges you to do that at a higher level, but still within the realm of what's possible for you to do, really helps you grow. And perhaps that's one aspect of why music is important for the formation of the soul, and why Plato focused on that so much as influential to society, is its capacity. Again, we've kind of bracketed the emotional side of it, but also its capacity intellectually to help you grasp patterns and get used to playing that game that we all have to. And story is the same way.
Well, I think you could even to kind of unbracket the emotion. I think that there's, yes, it does train you in pattern recognition, but it also trains you in having a positive emotional response to the recognition of patterns. That sense of by habituating yourself, by habituating your soul to respond joyfully or with excitement at the recognition of a pattern. It kind of trains that spirited part, like we were talking about a couple episodes ago when we were talking about education. It helps to form that spirited part by training you to by training your spirited emotions to respond to anticipations or intimations of a pattern, so that when you can carry that over. That's kind of continuing with the Platonic question. You can carry that over. You can carry that that habit of sort of letting it's basically the formation of the emotional side of a philosophical instinct, or it's forming an instinct to lead you in the direction of identifying and clarifying patterns by training your emotions to react in anticipation of a pattern, if that makes any sense.
Training your emotions to react in anticipation of a pattern. Yeah, I
It's
think
almost like it's like muscle memory in a way. Like, if you're someone who fights, someone who's a boxer, you have to train yourself to react instinctively to different movements that your opponent is making, so that you can counter before he completes the movement. It seems like, in a way, the emotional side of more complex music, if we're sticking with the question of patterns, is that there's an emotional association you are making with the appearance, with the search for patterns, and sort of here's something. Okay, what about this? There's an emotional connection or association that's made at the same time that your mind is doing that, so that at times you can, if you've trained your emotions sufficiently with complicated music and good music, it helps to give you that added emotional muscle memory, as it were, to guide you in a conversation, to guide you when you're reading something. Like if something doesn't sit well, if something that someone is writing or says doesn't sit well with you, if music can help you to kind of learn to, if not altogether trust that discomfort. You can at least be like, okay, why am I uncomfortable with this? What is this emotional response I'm used to? There's something is clashing. Something in the pattern of what they're saying doesn't fit. And if you are attentive to that kind of thing, it can lead you to seek out, like, is there some kind of contradiction in what you're saying, or is there what's odd about this? You can even think, it doesn't have to be confrontational like that. You can still have that same experience. You say something, or you realize you have to, if you're being logically consistent, you must also think this other thing. You're like, that doesn't sit well with me. You don't want to trust that emotional response wholeheartedly, but I think one of the benefits of having, if you have really tried to cultivate a musical formation, it helps you to train your emotions to be at least more trustworthy as instincts for uncovering the truth.
Yeah, I like that. Trustworthy as instincts for uncovering the truth. Yeah. I think that fits actually with the experience that a lot of people have, and social scientists have indicated this, and psychologists have indicated this, and a lot of time the emotional reaction precedes even the formation of a concept or an intellectual reaction. That there's a stimulus and then an emotional response, and then a split second later the formation of an image or a concept or a thought, and then a physical reaction. So yeah, training instinctual emotional responses would actually be extremely important for the intellectual life, because more often than not, that response is going to dictate what surfaces intellectually.
Interesting.
And music seems to play with that machinery, which does indicate that it can calibrate it one way or the other. And I think it's important to recognize that it does seem like music can negatively calibrate it, but for the same reason, I think it has to also do with just getting the full spectrum of the patterns, like you mentioned earlier, because if you overfit too much to one pattern, it destroys your ability to recognize everything else that's there. So yeah, in one sense, it might be bad to be like Mozart is the only thing and those are the patterns that matter, and everything else you can just disregard. I think that's going to warp you just as much as if all you listen to is aggressive death metal. Those are patterns, but if you overfit entirely that set of patterns, that will warp your ability to respond to everything else that's there and your emotional responses on both. So it does seem like, and this reminds me of things I've read and heard about training AI to learn and to teach, basically autodidactic AI. Like, how do you teach it how to learn? A lot of what is involved in it is flooding the system with just random noise, or throwing in chaos and messing everything up and having it discern the pattern again, because they found that if you keep things too simple and straightforward, it will overfit to the first pattern that it finds and conclude that is the archetype, and it start applying it everywhere. But then it's missing a lot of nuance, and it's not learning. So every once in a while, you just have to break the whole thing apart into a bunch of noise and have it reassemble again. And so other musical patterns or other story patterns aren't necessarily chaos and noise, but I think it's the same kind of idea, that you have to kind of radically shift the pattern sometimes, so that you realize, oh, the mechanism that I was relying on in that first case doesn't work here. There's something new at work that I have to make a guess on. And then as you kind of look at them both afterwards, you can see what's still in common between them and how it's working, but how you can't just operate based on one limited set of patterns, because there simply are more in the world that you're going to have to grasp. And if it comes, and if you think about it again as that process of dealing with change, then in terms, just for the sake of your own survival, intellectually and physically, you simply have to be able to deal with all those patterns.
To be somewhat meta about this, there's a kind of thematic recapitulation here of anti-fragility, which we've talked about multiple times over the last few episodes that we've met. It seems like there's musical training for mental anti-fragility, you might say.
Yeah, I think so.
Kind of what we do. It seems like that's what we're saying is at least one of the major measurements of whether or not music is good is whether or not it serves to be conducive to that kind of mental flexibility.
Right. But mental flexibility with the goal of, not with the goal of flexibility for its own sake or with the goal of chaos, but with the goal of being able to always fit yourself into the patterns appropriately. And that's how you survive, and that's how you thrive. But you have to be good at this pattern recognition machinery, at using that pattern recognition machinery in music and story, and probably other things that we talked about, like that exist to train that ability. But it's always to deal with change, because things are always changing. So how do you find the right way to fit in so you don't disintegrate in the change?
That's interesting.
And I think that's where anti-fragility, why it keeps coming up, is because that's a part that gets neglected, but it's a key component of being able to ride with change, is the ability to like work with breakdowns and use them as a way to aid your pattern recognition further.
Yeah, that's really, it's kind of interesting how that, it's almost like saying, no, that's an unformed thought. That would be too much. That would lead us to too much of a tangent. I was just going to comment on unformed thought and anti-fragility. We can move on.
Okay. There'll always be time for, I think that seems apropos, an unformed thought about anti-fragility.
Maybe this was it. It had to do with musical. There's music. You have to avoid, in order to have a good criteria for music, your approach to, there's like, multiple levels of anti-fragility you have to have, which is itself a matter of anti-fragility. You need to have those multiple levels, and they need to be resilient with respect to each other. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, I think that might be a good place to wrap it up. I think that I think also I was going to say that just the fact that something like your experience with listening to The Wall alone in the dark. Like the fact that something calls out for a particular setting and a particular level of attention is also a sign, perhaps, of what we've been talking about, of the complexity and of the value of the thing. Because nobody, well, maybe some people do, but I would never think of like sitting down and devoting my entire attention on a top 40 pop album. Maybe some of them, but again, only the ones that have that a more intricate quality. Maybe the album tracks are a lot more interesting than the radio cuts. But the fact that something calls out to be experienced with your exclusive attention and in a certain type of setting seems to be a sign of the complexity at work there that we've been talking
And
about.
I would even think that maybe I would be willing to do it once with one of those albums. Be like, okay, let's just hear the whole thing once all the way through. I can imagine doing that kind of listen with The Wall multiple times. And the same thing kind of goes for books too. There's, really, classics are the kind of thing that you can return to with renewed pleasure, indefinitely. That's one way of defining a classic, is something that just it continually repays rereading in a way that at some point in time with some stories you're like, okay, I can't get any more out of this, or maybe I need to wait a long time before I try because I feel like I've exhausted the well of insight, and I need to move on to something else. There are certain books which you can always go back to, and I think the same thing goes for music. That a sign of good music is something that you can return to it and you're still finding new, like, ooh, that's interesting, I didn't notice that before. Whereas with mediocre music, you maybe have that once or twice, but after a while you're just listening to it because you're used to it and you enjoy it and it's familiar, and it may be good, but it's not great.
Yeah, I think that's true.
I think it'd be important for us to identify the lacunae, I should say, because there are multiple, in the things we've said about music. We haven't touched at all on lyrics and sort of the lyrical presence in music, which is a really constant. There, even though it's not always with lyrics, it seems like most of human history, music has been accompanied by words, and it's really only at a certain rarefied degree of civilization that you have music without words. There's also the question of music and dancing, sort of rhythm. That's another thing that most of music in human history has been also associated with dancing. So that just in case anybody thinks they left that out, how they've clearly not thought about it. I know there's some things we just couldn't talk about yet, but I would be especially interested in talking more about lyrics and music, because that's another, I think that might be an episode's worth all on its own.
I think it would, and I think the rhythm, we've touched on it, but I think the rhythm question is very interesting as well. And I think, like I mentioned before, I think that more than almost anything else really kind of hits on the cultural fault lines based on what kind of responses it elicits. Because I think there's also just like when everybody starts, I mean, I've certainly been guilty of this myself, but like when something comes on and everybody starts kind of becomes seized by the music and starts dancing like crazy and losing themselves, there's a tendency, like in certain cultural, if you're from a certain cultural background, to be like what's going, this is uncomfortable for me, So I think a lot of times there are those sort of very deep-seated gut level reactions to types of rhythm that I think would be also fascinating territory for some exploration, because I think that just gets really outside of music and into something just very deep-seated that comes out in culture. Yeah. So perhaps let those topics percolate a little bit and we'll revisit them. But
We'll do.
I think this was it was interesting for me to see that connection. I think that's really helpful to see the connection between story and music and kind of how it's serving our pattern recognition. I think that's helpful to me. I didn't think about that before, but we have Pink Floyd and your late night experience to thank for that.
Just to throw it out there, I also this past week listened to the entire musical offering and most of the Art of the Fugue by Bach, just as a way of like, how similar are the experiences? And they're different in many ways, but the overall experience of being intrigued and having moments of reward and then increased intrigue That's the same for both. So, it wasn't just Pink Floyd.
Sure.
Plenty of Pink.
Well, I'm gonna have to listen to The Wall again. You've certainly whetted my appetite for it. All right. Well, thanks, man. We will revisit this next time.
Cool.
Till then.
Thanks, David.